Okay.
And we'll do a Q&A.
Except I don't have my glasses.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, you want?
Oh, can I use those? Yeah.
Try these, see if they work.
Oh, the middle age.
I don't think they've ever met either. So.
I'll just read the beginning of a story called The Fall of Berlin. Just a page. She loved her home so much, had loved it so deeply for so many years, that when she thought of her death, it was the house she felt sorry for. No one would ever hold this place as dear as she did. The house wasn't grand. From the outside, it was frankly plain. But she'd furnished it so deliberately, so delicately over time, that every shade of color or light, every nook and corner was cared for, warm and welcoming. Curated, they said now, about everything. Her home was curated. The furnishings were only her belongings and not permanent by nature, though she wished them to be. On the news recently, a venerable archaeologist in Syria had been murdered by militants. He'd been defending a cache of ancient artifacts from Palmyra, refusing to tell the radicals where they were. They cut his head off. When she heard it on the news, she cried. Courage, she thought. That was courage. But this was only a home, only her house. And even before she died, the whole place would be taken apart methodically, no sentiment wasted. Her chairs, rugs, lamps would be separated from each other with violent haste, never again to be a part of this perfect harmony. If she was lucky, they'd be sold to people who valued them. That was the best case, and even the best case was unbearable. She gazed out the window from her favorite armchair, a graceful prospect. In the breeze, her front yard trees dipped and swayed. The greatest of them was a Norfolk Island pine, its rounded needles like velvet. Beyond the moving bough, she could see a haze of blue lupins among the river rocks, and then the neighbor's hedge. Beyond the hedge was only sky, where on this sunlit late afternoon, a bank of cumulus had gathered, billowing flowers of atmosphere. Now was the time to give up what she loved. She knew that. But it was so hard. She should have specialized in Buddhists instead of fascists. Then maybe she'd be ready for the world to fall away. Ready to rise, her arms outstretched, with nothing to the left of her and nothing to the right. Enter the air.
I said, watch your board.
I have progressive, so I couldn't.
That was really beautiful. I should have read first. This is the first page of a story called Airborne. I'll leave it at that. We'll talk about more about it later. Jenna tells Dan he's crazy. He's home from work for 5 minutes. His tie is still knotted, and already he's nosing around the central air vents and the drains, inside the cabinets and behind the refrigerator. He hasn't even said hello to Lucy, their 3-year-old. Instead, he's sniffing the fireplace and the shower heads. He drops to his knees to check the carpet in the den. He stomps down the stairs to the basement. He pokes his head into the attic. It's the mold again. He says it's so bad he can smell it, and that's when Jenna tells him that he's crazy. The cleaning ladies are at the house all afternoon, and the place is awash in lemon-scented floor wax and furniture polish, spiked with the tang of Windex and bleach. Jenna believes that this cocktail of scrubs, cleansers, waxes, and sprays has a mood-enhancing effect stronger than Prozac, which she has never tried, but weaker than ecstasy, which she has. Colors seem brighter, shapes more distinct, as if the house sits on a mountaintop in the Alps instead of at the end of a cul-de-sac in Wilmette, Illinois. She tells Dan they pay good money for the house to smell like this. You're used to it, he says. If you spent all day out of the house, you'd notice it the second you came in. I'm going to pretend you didn't say that, she says. For your sake, I'm going to pretend you didn't say a word. In the 2 years since Jenna quit her job as assistant vice president of packaging for a specialty foods company to stay home with Lucy, she has heard him pose this question more times and in more ways than she can count. Just what is it that you do all day? Don't be that way, he says. You know what I mean. Yeah, she says. I know exactly what you mean.
I think I'm in the same boat as a lot of people here, where when I say that I have an idea and I don't know if it's a short story idea or a novel idea. So I'm curious if you two, both having written stories and short stories and novels, if you have an idea, how you make the decision between the two, what you take into consideration, and if there's anything you've ever developed one way and then realized it should have been the other format.
That I'm not sure.
Having written short stories for a long time, when I started working on the novel, I knew it was a novel. I mean, and there was no way what I wanted to do I couldn't do it in even 40 or 50 pages. I knew from the beginning it was going to be a really big thing. So in that case, I knew. The thing I'm working on now, I think I went into it hoping it was a novel. I had a moment where I thought, like, uh-oh, maybe this isn't, but then I kept plowing ahead. And so I think I often don't know much about this thing that I'm writing, except I get a sense of the shape early on. So even from the idea or the first line or the voice that I hear or the image that I want to do, there's something around it that lets me know roughly what it is, like whether it's a novel or a short story, and then maybe how big it's going to be. I don't know about you. Like you said with Fight No More, it was a novel. Was it ever a novel?
No. Okay. I always, I don't, it sounds coy or stupid depending on, the charity of your interpretation for me to say that I don't really have ideas, but I don't really have ideas exactly. I mean, I don't have them before I sit down to write something. I just sit down to write and then whatever, happens. But so I'm not, unfortunately, calculated enough to make such a, clever decision, really. I did when I first started out writing, maybe my first 2 or 3 books. I sort of planned in advance, but I don't really anymore. Beyond maybe sometimes having a title before I write the book, because I just like having titles.
What do you find the value of these short fiction nowadays? Sometimes they call them flash fiction or microfiction. But in this fast-paced world, some people complain, I don't have time to read, but they see something like Lydia Davis and they say, wow. And are any of your stories shorts or micro stories?
Yeah. I think, there was this, I don't see these articles much anymore, but for a while people were saying like, oh, this is going to bring about some sort of renaissance of the short story because people can read them on their phones and they can read them on the way to work or wherever they read things. Which I don't think is true, because I think a really good short story, even if you're willing to give it time to let it work on you the way that it's supposed to, like a Lydia Davis story, the fact that it's a paragraph or a couple sentences, it's not because it neatly resolves itself in a paragraph, it messes you up when you read it. Like you read it and it troubles something in you and you can't put it right for a while. And I think whether it's shorter or longer, and flash fiction does something too, like in a paragraph, it has to get you somewhere where you're a little disturbed. And I think the idea that you'd read that on the way to work and then like sit down at your desk and start processing spreadsheets is probably the most destructive thing to productivity in America. It could be a good thing, but I don't think it's about format or time. I think a good story, I think people have a hunger for them, but I think that part of the thing with the short story is the investment of time reading it might be short, but I think it's supposed to stick with you and really make a claim on you that you have to be willing to allow it to do.
Also, for that period of time, and I think I think you're right, people aren't sort of talking about this because it ceased to be interesting as much anymore. Not that flash fiction isn't interesting or doesn't exist or whatever, but the conversation around how it was going to rejuvenate. First of all, I don't think really the form needs rejuvenation. Yeah. Like it's looking pretty Botox to me. I don't know. I think people like short stories. And they have also, what about poems? If people want to read something really short form, we do have those, those exist. So, and they've always been good at sort of crystallizing moments for us. Sometimes moments that take, 50 pages to achieve in a novel. Mm-hmm. These are moments that poems, if we know how to read them, and not bad poems, but good ones, that can bring us so quickly. So I sort of thought that was a lot of, Much Ado About Nothing around flash fiction, right. Just like people talking about irony being dead after September 11th or something, No. Anyway, thank you. I think
there was a hope that if we talked about it enough that people would start paying short story writers more. There'd be a commercial, somebody was going to make money off of it, and it didn't work. Yeah. We tried.
Of all the subjects that you could possibly choose to write about, how do you choose? How do you choose them, and have those choices changed over the course of your careers?
So Lydia mentioned earlier that you just start to write. Like, you don't start with an idea, you write your way into the idea. And I think that's true for me as well. Like, I'll start with something and write and sort of see if it becomes something that's interesting to me or something I care about. And a lot of times, I'm not an essayist. I'm writing towards a story. I want the story to matter. I want there to be characters or voice or something that draws you in. And sometimes it's only after the fact that you recognize what the issues were, that you're interested in or what you were grappling with. And the outside world can throw those into relief. So I mentioned, like, when I was looking at the stories that go into This Is Not a Love Song, like, deception is a big part of it. A lot of these stories about relationships, and I feel like that deception, self-deception is a big part of that. And I thought about it in a very personal way here. But then as the stories kind of came together, and I started to think about how does that happen in a larger way. And then given the kind of, given these times, the political climate we're in right now, some of the self-deceptions become more apparent. So, like, this isn't maybe it's not a foreground issue in the collection, but I think it rattles around in there. I mean, anybody who grows up white in America is schooled, and I mean schooled, in self-deception. There are stories we tell ourselves and about our world and about the world we live in to get by. And when somebody pierces those deceptions, it's painful, and people will go to great lengths to maintain that. So in the stories, it happens in relationships, and there's a couple of stories where it happens beyond the level of the relationship. But I don't think I saw that in writing the stories originally. But when the book came out, in 2019, that to me felt suddenly foregrounded in a way.
Yeah, I've always been really interested in self-deception too. I've been interested in people's blind spots for all of my writing career. Just the idea that we can't, in a way, know ourselves sometimes as well as other people know us, because we just have these blind spots in our visions of ourselves, things we will never know about how we seem. Sometimes we do discover stuff about ourselves through time. I mean, I hope we do. Otherwise, it's all very sad and tragic, that we bother to hang around. But, just like when you look back at old things of yours and you're sort of ashamed by maybe something you did, something you wrote, some way you were at a certain moment in time. I have that with, like, almost every book I write. The further in time I move away from it, the less it seems like something I did. And the more it seems like something done by someone I don't recognize anymore. But I, at the beginning of my career, was more interested in satire and sort of like sharp, kind of biting writing. Like, I had one book, I think my second book was called George Bush, Dark Prince of Love, which was about actually Bush Sr. And this woman's obsession with him and stuff. So it was quite overtly political satire. And I still occasionally write books that are sort of satirical and broad, but mostly I write more about the things that make me, feel like crying or laughing. I've become, I think, less interested in cynicism as the years went on, and more interested in just idealism and being vulnerable. Sort of psychologically and also just philosophically, rather than closed, rather than shuttered.
Hi, do you have advice for aspiring short fiction writers in the room? And more specifically, are there any really tired short story cliches that you would recommend avoiding? The kind of "it was all a nightmare in the end" kind of a conclusion, or anything like that you've just seen over and over again and makes you roll your eyes?
So one thing I'd suggest, if you have the opportunity anywhere, for a while I was a reader for a magazine, and so I would have to read 25 stories a week, and so I got to read a lot of what people were submitting. So it exposes a lot of the cliches, because you might think you're doing something totally original and you read it, 100 times in a month. So it's really important to see what's out there. I think in some ways, like everything could be a cliche, could be reduced to the level of cliche. A lot of it's in how you carry it off. Although having it all be a dream, maybe we should avoid that. That one might be worth putting on the shelf. But other advice, like I teach, and so my students come to me with these kinds of questions all the time, and I think that you have to be open to criticism. Like, you have to find people who you trust as readers, not necessarily your friends who tell you how great your work is. You need somebody who you trust, who will tell you when you're on and when you're off, somebody who knows you at your best and will push you to get there. And in some ways, you just have to be a little bit bulletproof. You send stuff out, you get told no so many times. A lot. I had this conversation with somebody recently. I counted up rejections. So the last story that I had that was in Best American Short Stories was turned down 26 times before it was accepted by the magazine that then got it into Best American. So take that, 26 editors.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the same advice, you'd give to any writer, which is read a lot, read a lot in the form that you're interested in writing in, but also just read in a way that is a bit uncomfortable for you. So don't just read things that are like things you've always known, or the stuff that reminds you of what you want to do or whatever, but also read the things that you don't like at first as you start to read them, and just like try to suppress your antipathy toward them until you can get through them. Because if you don't read the new and be exposed to the new, your stuff is never going to be ambitious, and it's never going to be sort of stretching itself out beyond what you already know. And we never know enough, right? We never already know enough. So just go as a reader into the new, and maybe one day then as a writer you'll go into the new too, and you won't even worry about cliche.
I'm interested in what kind of distinctions you might draw regarding short stories that you might have in your own books, in other words, your own books that are collections of short stories of your own, as opposed to short stories that you might write for journals, magazines, anthologies that are edited by others. The kinds of different approaches you might take with regard to those publications. In other words, the ways that they've been that they're published, where they're housed, I guess, is what kind of distinctions and what kind of approaches do you take for them? I hope the question makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I actually really think you'd be better to answer this, because I've never really written a story for a journal or for a magazine explicitly. So
Yeah, so when I got started, I did what a lot of people do, which is I'd write stories, and then I have this vast spreadsheet that I kept in the days before any of this was done online, back when it was all done with big manila envelopes and self-addressed stamped envelopes and actual physical paper. And I would just send things out to magazines that I read or that I admired, that I hoped to appear in, without any sense of whether the story, like I thought the story was right for them. I mean, everybody I sent to, I thought they'd be crazy to turn this down. And then you'd send to the first 10, and then you'd get 10 rejections, then you'd send to the next 10 or 12, and you'd work your way through. And sometimes the message you pick up from that is, it's the editor's fault, and they don't see my brilliance. Usually the message is I gotta pull this back and revise and revise and revise. And that's probably the other piece of advice for writers in the room is revise, revise, revise. I mean, for a lot of people, it's a lot of effort to write the story once and to get a first draft, but that's the beginning of the process, really. Trying to figure out what the story really is more. So, for me then, writing, I guess I have some sense now of what stories might be more appropriate to some venues than others. Like obviously there's a story in the collection that's kind of flash fiction. It's only a few pages. I knew that there were places that were more receptive to that kind of work. There's some stories in the collection that are really just like big voice-driven kind of stories, and I know editors who have a taste for that. So I mean, in there, even then, it wasn't like I got sent up once and was taken. I guess the big difference between the collection and the story, the magazines and then the collection, was the opportunity in the collection to look at stories I'd written over a long period of time and think about how they fit together, because the longest story the oldest story in the collection was the one that's most heavily rewritten. It changed entirely it was the first story I ever published, and I was incredibly proud of it. And when I went back to look at it years later and think about how it fit in the collection, it didn't, because it was a gimmick. It all revolved around a surprise ending in a way, something that the narrator or the character hadn't revealed to us, the reader, through the first 20 pages, and suddenly it sprang up at us at the end, and I thought I was so clever. And it wasn't worth it. So the great thing about the collection is it let me look at them and think about how they would fit together and where the conversation was taking place in a way that when you're just publishing in magazines, you're just hoping for a spot, Thank you.
So, I actually write myself, and I'm actually in high school, and I write for my school magazine, and one of the biggest problems is I write it, I send it, and it gets out there, but no one reads it. So, like, coming up as a writer, how did you get your stories out there? How did you make sure people knew that you wrote it and that this was yours, and that how did you make yourself known?
Well, I can say that I did not succeed in making myself known in high school. So I think you're ahead of the game anyway. And also now it's in a way easier and in a way harder than it was when we were young, because there's content everywhere, and so in a way that's bad, right? Because we have this just seeming wash of content everywhere in the digisphere, or whatever you call it. And at the same time, it's easier than ever for you to make your things available, right, to people's eyes. It's easier technically and in terms of the numbers of people who can be exposed without really having to theoretically pay any money, like buy a book or anything. People can be exposed to your work, right? So I think that's a hopeful thing.
Yeah.
I think one trick I'm told works sometimes is sort of affinity communities. Finding a community of people who are interested in writing and reading about the same things that you're writing and reading about, and just be a participant and engaged in that community, and then people will want to read your work because there are people there you already know, or they're sort of pre-screened by their interest in the same matters that you're interested in. That doesn't always work if sort of your interest is rather general, which is what happens to me. But do you have counsel on that? I don't know.
Oh, I mean, I completely understand how you feel that you publish a story and then it's out there and no one's reading it, and you're thinking, where is the praise? Where is it? Why has no one carried me like on their shoulders through a crowd? Like, why is there no celebration? Where's the confetti cannon? Like, I published a story. But I think that just means that you are a writer. Because it matters to you, but you have to understand that, even if it's not mass acclaim, you're reaching readers. Someone's gonna pick up the story and read it, and whether they ever say anything to you, like, hey, that was a great story, or not, you're connecting. And I think that Lydia's right about looking for ways to reach beyond like, it's great that you're publishing the school magazine in high school, because you're, again, way ahead of where I was. But like a lot of my students are part of online communities where they share stories, and they have these vast networks of people, and they're always kind of cheering each other on. And so the technology does enable you to reach out and find more people who care about the work that you do.
I think you maybe brought this up. I was wondering how much language plays into the revision process, or even the initial process of writing. Like, is it mostly about revising the storytelling part of it, or is it more about the language? Like, do you belabor one more than the other? Are they the same? Do you give the same amount of time to that process? I guess I'm talking about language versus story.
Yeah.
That's the question.
I mean, for me, most revision now is language revision, where I'm just kind of, it's almost like I just nitpick sentences, like I'm almost molesting them in a certain sense. I really just like continue to try to fish at them and poke at them until they don't sit wrong with me or whatever. So it really is just about this micro level. I'm even sort of can become obsessed with how often a certain word exists in a text and wish to rid myself, because I've noticed that in published books sometimes it was never noticed by anyone, but I used the same bizarre word 3 times in one page or something. I'm like, how did I do that? That's just embarrassing. It's like walking around with spinach in your teeth,
You remember what the word was?
I've done it multiple times with multiple words.
Oh.
There's whole endings of books I would rewrite if I could. And so recently for me, the past few books it's really been about kind of going through with this fine-tooth comb sort of obsessively and trying to make the language cleaner for myself. But occasionally there's a plot thing that will happen too, but mostly it's about that for me. I don't know about you.
Yeah, it's a mixed story to story. I'm pretty obsessive about revision, and it can mean like changing the point of view. It can mean reworking whole parts of it, figuring out only the 3 pages in the middle work and throwing away everything else. So when I get to the part where I'm tinkering, not tinkering, but when I'm on the language level, that's when I feel like I'm on the glide path home, because a lot of the heavy lifting happens first.
I was really wondering how you like control that tone and how you found the balance between like the satirical aspect and the more, I guess, the aspect of the book that is more sort of mourning the loss of nature.
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep it quick, but thank you so much for asking that and for the kind words about the book, and also for just noticing how the tone changes so radically from the beginning of that book. In the beginning of there's this kid who's just like a budding capitalist, and in this very literal way, he goes around with like holding like pouches of coins in his mouth and stuff. And it's modeled on my brother, but anyway. And then by the end, he's sneaking into these zoos to be near, like physically near these creatures that are sort of endlings, you know, sort of some of the last creatures of their kind. And of course, it's not really approved, you know, to sneak into zoo enclosures and do this. So. But it does, the tone changes a lot from this almost ribald kind of tone to this more elegiac tone over the course of the book, and that's sort of a weird thing to do in a novel. And so I don't know if you think I pulled it off, thank you. I really appreciate it. But it's what I wanted to do, but it's an odd way to manage a novel. So thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Great. Thank you.